He looked like the future. That was the first illusion. Before the apology, before the court, before the headlines turned his name into a warning, BI looked like the kind of idol K-pop was built to worship. Young, gifted, self-made enough to feel dangerous, polished enough to feel inevitable. He was not just another face in a successful group. He was the one people pointed to when they wanted proof that talent could arrive early and hit hard. As the leader of iKON, he was widely seen as one of the group's core creative forces, with songwriting and production credits that helped define its identity. And that is exactly why the fall would feel so violent later. Because idols like BI are not marketed as ordinary stars. They are sold as possibility, potential with a pulse. The boy who writes, leads, performs, and seems to understand the machine well enough to outrun it. The public does not just admire someone like that, it invests in him. It builds a future around him before he has even finished becoming himself. That is where stories like this get dangerous. Not at the scandal, not at the arrest, not even at the sentence, much earlier. At the moment, the world decides someone is too talented to fail. Born Kim Hanbin on October 22, 1996, B. I entered public life young and entered it carrying something heavier than fame, expectation. Long before his name became linked to controversy, he had already been framed as one of those rare K-pop figures who felt bigger than idol polish alone. He was not only performing the songs, he was helping shape them. He was not just inside the image, he was helping build it. That distinction matters because once a young artist is seen as both star and architect, the public starts reading him differently. Not as replaceable, as essential. And essential people fall harder. Because the higher the belief, the uglier the correction. BI's rise through YG Entertainment and into iKON carried the kind of momentum that makes the future seem pre-written. The group's early impact, his creative role, the aura of discipline and hunger around him, it all fed the same story. Here was a young man who wasn't just made for success, but for authorship. He looked like someone who could build an empire before 30. That is a dangerous image to wear when you are still young enough to break in ways the public refuses to imagine. Because genius is one of the cruelest labels a public figure can receive. It flatters you. It elevates you, and then it quietly removes your right to fail like a normal human being. That is what was happening underneath the image. The public saw control, direction, talent sharp enough to cut through the noise. What it did not see, or did not want to see, was how unstable that kind of pressure can become when it lands on someone still forming in public. K-pop is ruthless to ordinary idols. To the ones marked as exceptional, it is even worse. They are not only expected to succeed, they are expected to justify the myth around them every single time they appear. BI was carrying that myth early, and for a while, he carried it well enough to make it look natural. That may be the darkest part of the beginning. Nothing in the first version of his story seemed built for ruin. The public had already chosen the narrative it wanted, the talented leader, the creative center, the young man with too much ability to stay small, the one who looked like he would keep climbing because he knew how to make ambition look disciplined rather than reckless. But ambition can hide other things: pressure, fear, impulse. A private life cracking underneath a public image, still being praised for its strength. That is why BI's story does not begin with the scandal that later swallowed his name. It begins with the making of a symbol, a young artist people believed in so hard that when the story broke, it did not just damage his career, it shattered the future they had already written for him. And once that future started collapsing, nothing about the fall would stay small. The frightening part is this. By the time the public realized how much power BI actually had inside iKON, it was already too late to see him as just another idol. He wasn't decoration. He wasn't a lucky face in a successful group. He wasn't even just the leader. He was the engine. And engines burn hotter than anyone notices until something catches fire. That was the second illusion around BI. The idea that talent would protect him. Because once iKON started rising, BI's image changed fast. He was no longer simply a promising trainee who made people curious. He became the proof that YG had found another young mind worth betting on, a producer, a writer, a leader with enough authority to make the group feel shaped rather than assembled. That kind of role is intoxicating in public, but dangerous in private. The more a career starts depending on one person's instincts, the less room that person has to be unstable, confused, tired, reckless, or human. And BI was still very young. That matters more than fans like to admit. Because the industry loves calling someone a genius long before it has to deal with the cost of building a career around that word. Genius sounds glamorous from the outside. Inside, it can feel like suffocation. It means every success becomes expectation. Every strong performance becomes a baseline. Every mistake becomes a betrayal of the myth people were already selling on your behalf. BI was living inside that myth. The group's success kept feeding it, his credits fed it, his leadership fed it. The public started reading him less like a performer and more like a promise. The future of iKON, the creative center, the young man with too much ability to collapse. That is the kind of story people love, because it feels clean, linear, upward. It makes the audience feel safe investing in someone because the rise looks rational, even destined. But destiny is one of the most dangerous lies celebrity ever tells. Because while the public was admiring the discipline, something darker was already sitting underneath the image: pressure without oxygen. This is the part where a lot of idol stories start splitting in two. There is the version the audience sees: success, charisma, leadership, momentum. Then there is the other version, the one built out of exhaustion, self-medication, bad decisions, private panic, and the desperate need to keep functioning while the machine keeps calling you exceptional. You do not see that version until it leaks. And when it leaked in BI's case, it did not just bruise the image, it poisoned it. Because the story that exploded later was not shocking only because drugs were involved. It was shocking because of who he had been positioned to become. Korea Times later reported that I received a suspended sentence over marijuana and LSD use tied to 2016. But before the sentence, before the courtroom, before the legal language, there was a much more brutal public moment. The instant people realized the future they had invested in might have been rotting underneath the surface for years. That changes the mood completely. A scandal attached to an ordinary idol is one thing. A scandal attached to the supposed brain of a rising empire is another. Because now the public is not just reacting to a crime or controversy, it is reacting to broken faith, to the collapse of an idea, to the humiliation of having believed too hard in a version of someone that suddenly looks unstable in retrospect. And instability is contagious. Once BI's name started shifting from talent to scandal, iKON's whole story felt infected by it. Not because the group had done the same things, but because he had been so central to its identity that separating the fall from the structure around him became almost impossible. The prodigy was now the problem. The architect was now the crack in the building. The person who once made the future feel secure was suddenly the reason it looked fragile. That is when the rise stopped being inspiring and started becoming tragic. Because the next chapter would not just be about one bad decision. It would be about public disgrace, departure, and the moment a young man who looked built to lead had to watch the future close on him in real time. Then the story detonated. Not slowly, not gracefully, not in a way that allowed distance. One moment, BI was still being read as the young architect of iKON's future. The next, his name was everywhere for the wrong reason. In 2019, reports tied him to allegations of attempting to purchase LSD and using illegal drugs years earlier. The shock was immediate, but the real damage came from what followed. BI left iKON, and the image that had taken years to build collapsed almost overnight. Korea Times later reported that in 2021, he received a 3-year prison sentence suspended for 4 years, along with community service and drug treatment education, in the case related to marijuana and LSD use from 2016. That is when the myth broke. Because scandals do not hit everyone the same way. When an idol built on visuals or charm falls, the public feels disappointment. When the person at the center of a group's creative identity falls, the public feels betrayal. B.I. was not only famous, he had been positioned as direction, authorship, control. So when his name became attached to drugs, the scandal felt bigger than one person's mistake. It felt like the future people had already invested in had been ripped up in front of them. And once that happens, the public gets cruel. It rewrites the past. It reinterprets old interviews. It looks back at confidence and starts calling it arrogance. It looks back at pressure and starts calling it weakness. That is the brutality of a public collapse. The scandal does not just attack the present. It contaminates everything that came before it. For B.I., leaving iKON was the most visible proof that the damage was not theoretical. It was structural. He was gone from the group he had helped define. The role that once made him powerful now made the fall even harder to watch, because everyone could see exactly how much had been lost. Not just his position, his momentum, his narrative, his right to keep being seen as the golden future of anything. And yet, this is where the story becomes darker than scandal. Because after the outrage, after the exit, after the legal consequences, one question stayed behind. What do you do when the thing that made you exceptional becomes the reason people can no longer look at you the same way? That was the real punishment. Not only the sentence, not only the headlines, but the silence after the collapse, the moment B.I. had to exist as a man still alive, still talented, but no longer protected by the myth that once carried him. He came back. That was the part people didn't know what to do with. Because scandal stories are easier to consume when they end in one clean fall. The rise, the mistake, the punishment, the disappearance, simple, satisfying, easy to file away. But B.I.'s story refused to stay that neat. After the collapse, after the headlines, after iKON moved on without him, he did something more difficult than disappearing. He kept going, and that changed the meaning of everything. Because once a person survives public ruin, the question is no longer, did he fall? The question becomes, what is left after the fall? With B.I., what remained was the one thing scandal had not fully destroyed: the work, the instinct. The part of him that had been building music before the public ever turned him into a symbol, then into a warning. That is what makes his story more unsettling than a simple downfall. He was not just a fallen idol. He was a young man forced to keep creating after the myth around him had already burned to the ground. That is a harsher kind of survival, because comebacks are never just comebacks, not after disgrace. Every release becomes a test. Every appearance becomes a question. Is the talent still enough? Is the public willing to separate the art from the damage? Is redemption even real, or just another story people tell because they are uncomfortable with endings that stay ugly forever? B.I. lives inside those questions now. Not as the genius people once trusted too easily, not as the scandal people once condemned too quickly, but as something more complicated. A man who lost the future they had written for him, then kept walking anyway. And maybe that is the final shape of his story. Not perfection, not innocence, not erasure, just consequence, talent, and the uncomfortable truth that some people do not disappear after they fall. They return carrying the ruin with them.